Well, look, there's no books for young boys. We have abandoned them. This idea of boys will be boys, we just kind of let them go. And
Hey everyone, it's Dave Neal with a bonus episode of the Rush Hour podcast, coming to you from my mobile studio setup. Not a bad view from here, right? It's a bit of a different setup than usual, but honestly, it gives us a chance to dive into things in a more relaxed, off-the-cuff way. Today I've got the latest updates on the ongoing situation involving Justin Baldoni and Blake Lively, which continues to evolve and spark conversation across media and online spaces. A new article has just been published by the New York Times, and as you might expect, it's already getting a lot of attention. At first glance, the piece comes across as polished and credible, with the kind of tone and presentation you'd expect from a major publication. However, it's important to keep in mind the outlet's earlier coverage of this story, which initially framed Blake Lively as the central figure in distress. As more information surfaced, Baldoni stepped forward to share his perspective, offering additional context that complicated the original narrative. Despite that, this latest piece seems to lean into the same framing rather than expanding the conversation or introducing more nuance. That raises some interesting questions about how stories evolve and sometimes don't once a particular angle has been established. I also want to bring in some thoughtful analysis from people online who've been following this closely. While it's true that the internet can sometimes jump to conclusions or get things wrong, there are also individuals who take the time to break things down carefully, compare sources, and highlight inconsistencies or overlook details. In this case, I've come across some genuinely solid commentary that adds depth to the discussion. I'll walk through a few of those insights, read some excerpts, and share my own thoughts along the way so we can get a fuller picture of what's really going on here. One comment really captures the core criticism. The New York Times is being called out for not revisiting or addressing several incidents it previously reported that now seem to have quietly disappeared from the narrative. At the same time, there's also the observation that a number of the allegations tied to Blake Lively have shifted over time or been dropped altogether. A key example often mentioned is the central dance video claim, which reportedly changed once it became known that audio existed adding context that may not have aligned with the earlier portrayal. Critics also point out that the article doesn't fully engage with several counter-arguments from Justin Baldoni. Among those are claims that Lively improvised a kiss prior to filming, as well as disputed accounts regarding an incident where Baldoni was accused of entering her dressing room while she was undressed. Skeptics are asking a straightforward question here. Where is the verifiable evidence supporting these claims, and why isn't that being clearly addressed? All of this feeds into a broader concern about standards of proof when serious allegations are involved. When claims carry significant weight, audiences expect them to be backed by strong, consistent evidence. There were also suggestions early on that additional information or documentation would surface to support certain narratives, but that material never fully emerged. That gap has led some to question whether initial sources may have been incomplete, misinterpreted, or even misinformed. Another layer to this situation involves misinformation circulating online. At one point, alleged HR complaints began spreading across social media platforms. Some content creators shared these documents without verifying their authenticity, not necessarily out of bad intent, but it demonstrates how quickly unverified information can gain traction. Situations like this highlight the possibility that narratives can be influenced or shaped behind the scenes, intentionally or otherwise. Looking more closely at the article itself, some critics argue that its framing plays a significant role in how readers interpret the story, rather than neutrally presenting competing claims. The structure appears to assume that questionable behavior occurred and then focuses on debating the extent or severity of it. That kind of framing can subtly guide readers toward a particular conclusion before they've had a chance to weigh all sides equally, which is why it's become such a central point of discussion in reactions to the piece. For example, describing a scene as an affectionate slow dance leaves out the important detail that it was part of a script, which changes how that moment should be interpreted. Similarly, references to certain topics are sometimes framed in a way that subtly suggests wrongdoing, even when the full context might tell a more nuanced story. There's also criticism that the article blends fictional elements from the film itself with real-life allegations involving Blake Lively and Justin Baldoni, which can blur the line between storytelling and factual reporting, potentially confusing readers. Another key concern being raised is the issue of balance. When serious accusations are made, especially ones that can significantly impact someone's career and reputation, there's an expectation that all sides are given a fair opportunity to respond. In this case, some argue that Baldoni wasn't initially given enough time or space to present his perspective before the narrative gained traction, which can shape public opinion early on in a way that's hard to reverse. The conversation also extends into the legal and professional standards of film sets, particularly in the post-MATA movement era. Industry practices have evolved, with clearer protocols around consent, the use of intimacy coordinators, and pre-approved choreography for physical scenes. These measures are meant to protect everyone involved and ensure transparency. However, there are claims that such protocols may not have been applied consistently in this situation, which adds another layer of complexity. If standards weren't uniformly followed, it raises questions about accountability and whether expectations were clearly communicated to everyone on set. As a result, the case itself has become increasingly complicated, involving a mix of allegations, counterclaims, and legal interpretations. Some view it primarily as a harassment issue, while others see it as a dispute over creative control, professional boundaries, and public image. That divide in interpretation is part of what keeps the story evolving. There's also an interesting gap between how the situation is being discussed online versus how it's being presented in outlets like the New York Times online communities. After reviewing available clips, statements, and timeline may lean toward one interpretation, while mainstream media coverage can frame the story differently. This contrast highlights how much influence framing and narrative structure have on shaping public opinion. Another detail mentioned is how the speaker was indirectly referenced in the article simply as a podcaster without being named. It's a small point, but it reflects a broader media practice where sources or commentators are included in a general sense without specific attribution, which can affect transparency and credibility. Overall, this situation illustrates just how complex modern media narratives can become, with a mix of partial information, evolving claims, selective reporting, and potential bias. It becomes increasingly important for audiences to approach stories critically, looking at multiple sources, questioning framing choices, and being open to the possibility that the full picture may be more complicated than any single version suggests.